In the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, where the trees stand older than the memory of man and the fog rolls in like a living thing, there exists a valley the locals refuse to name. It's the kind of place that disappears from maps, the kind of silence that swallows even the sound of your own breath. Long ago, travelers said you could hear laughter echoing through the hollows at night, soft, childlike, and wrong. But when they followed the sound, they found only animal bones and rusted fences curling back into the soil. The stories always begin the same way: a stranger takes a wrong turn. A car breaks down. A hiker wanders too far. And then they see them, the faces that look too similar, the children with the same hollow eyes, the generations that never left. Some call them the forgotten family, others the cousins of the dark valley. No one dares to speak their name out loud anymore. What little is known comes from fragments: an abandoned church filled with photographs that should never have existed, birth records written in trembling hands, and a film reel too damaged to show what it once captured. But the faces remain. They stare back through time, through the lens, through the lies America told itself about its hidden places. They were not born in sin nor in sickness, but in a pact sealed long before anyone alive could remember, a promise whispered from cousin to cousin, generation after generation, to keep their blood pure and their world closed. Hidden from the world, they became something else entirely. And now, after a century of silence, the valley breathes again. Someone, or something, has stirred the generations awake. The discovery began on a fog-drenched morning in early October, when a young hiker named Eli Monroe veered off a marked trail in the Monongahela forest, chasing the faint glimmer of what looked like old fence wire half-buried beneath moss. The air was still, heavy with the smell of rot and rain-soaked bark. He thought he'd stumbled upon the remnants of an old farmstead, maybe a forgotten homestead swallowed by time. But as he pushed through the thicket, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting like fingers trying to hold him back. The ground softened under his boots, and every sound, his breath, the crack of a twig, seemed to echo unnaturally far. Then came the quiet, that unnerving silence that swallows even the insects. That's when he saw it, a sagging wooden sign nailed to a tree, the paint long faded, the only word still legible being hollow. Eli followed what remained of a dirt path, nearly hidden beneath years of dead leaves. It led downhill into a narrow gorge where the sunlight struggled to reach the ground. There, scattered among the roots, stood the remnants of a settlement, weathered cabins, their roofs caved in and windows boarded from the inside. Rusted cooking pots still sat on broken stoves, children's shoes lay in piles by the doorsteps, and family portraits, bleached to ghosts by time, stared out from cracked picture frames. None of it looked abandoned in a hurry. It looked as if the people had simply faded away, leaving behind the traces of lives that never should have existed together. What unnerved Eli most wasn't what he saw, but what he didn't. There were no animal sounds, no wind through the trees, no sign of human disturbance. It felt preserved, as though time had stopped out of respect or fear. He tried calling out, his voice trembling in the still air, but the echo that came back didn't sound like his own. It was higher, faintly distorted, like the voice of a child repeating him from somewhere deep within the woods. That was when he noticed the shapes watching him from behind the cabin windows, too still to be living, yet unmistakably human. His flashlight flickered, and in that momentary pulse of light, he caught the outline of faces that looked eerily alike, all pale, expressionless, and unblinking. When the light steadied again, they were gone. Panic seized him, and he stumbled backward, crashing through branches until he found the trail again. By the time he reached the main path, the air felt lighter, the forest alive once more. But when he looked back, the trail he'd followed was gone, swallowed completely by the woods, as if it had never been there at all. Days after Eli's encounter, local authorities dismissed his story as fatigue or hallucination, but a historian named Grace Holloway decided to see for herself. She specialized in forgotten settlements, the kind that never made it into textbooks, and the mention of a hidden valley with no record of existence stirred something deep in her curiosity. She retraced Eli's steps, this time using old surveyor maps from the 1930s that hinted at a small congregation named the Covenant of Hollow Grace. The name itself felt wrong, almost deliberately misleading, as if designed to obscure more than it revealed. After 3 days of searching, She finally stumbled upon what Eli had described, the remains of a forgotten world suffocating under ivy and decay. Among the ruins stood an old church, its steeple bent, its bell long fallen into the earth. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, creaking like something alive as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic. Shafts of light cut through holes in the roof, illuminating rows of wooden pews warped by years of dampness. On the altar lay a Bible so ancient its pages had fused together, but beneath it, tucked inside a carved compartment, she found something stranger, an assortment of family records. They weren't written on proper parchment but on scraps of cloth and brown paper, tied together with faded string. The entries were meticulous, documenting births, marriages, and deaths spanning nearly a century. But every name, every union, connected back to the same handful of surnames, each generation looping back into itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. Grace's hands trembled as she unfolded an old photograph tucked within the records. It depicted what appeared to be a wedding, two young people standing before the very same altar, surrounded by family members whose faces looked disturbingly similar. Their eyes were vacant, their expressions strangely serene, as though they were posing for something sacred yet profoundly unnatural. She turned the photo over. A date had been scribbled on the back, 1911, and beneath it, a single phrase, "The blood remains unbroken." As she stood there, the silence deepened, broken only by the soft groan of the wooden beams above. She could feel eyes on her, though she was alone. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift with her every breath. Then she heard the faintest whisper, almost like the brushing of dry leaves, coming from the stairwell leading below the altar. It was rhythmic, too deliberate to be the wind. Her lantern flickered as she knelt, revealing a narrow trapdoor half covered in dust, its iron handle cold against her skin. She pulled it open, and a draught of air rushed out, carrying with it a smell she would never forget, the scent of something that had been waiting far too long to be found. When Grace lifted the trapdoor, a wave of air rolled out thick with mold and something faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. The lantern's flame trembled, throwing shadows across the stone steps that descended into the earth. She hesitated, listening for movement, but only a low hum filled the space, as if the walls themselves were breathing. She descended slowly, each step groaning beneath her weight until the staircase opened into a small underground chamber lined with shelves. The shelves were filled with jars, hundreds of them, each containing what looked like preserved specimens, bone fragments, tufts of hair, even small, cloudy eyes suspended in amber liquid. Grace's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she scanned the room, her light catching on something carved into the wall. The word children had been etched again and again, in letters so deep it seemed whoever had done it was desperate to be remembered. At the far end of the room stood a wooden door with a latch made of iron. It was slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond came the faint sound of movement, a shuffling too slow to belong to an animal. Grace called out softly, her voice barely carrying, but there was no answer. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. The smell intensified, thick and warm like the breath of something living. Her lantern revealed a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the ground, and at its end, a cluster of figures stood watching her. They were children, or at least, they appeared to be. Their clothes were handmade, filthy, and their skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. A retired clerk from the Department of Vital Records, when questioned, admitted in a hushed voice that this wasn't the first time those names had disappeared. He remembered seeing similar erasures back in the 1970s when an anthropologist had tried to map isolated genetic lines across Appalachia. That researcher had vanished too, leaving behind only a single page of notes describing a family so insular the state pretends it never existed. The more investigators dug, the stranger it became. Land deeds for the valley were untraceable, listed under corporations that had dissolved decades ago. Property boundaries overlapped in impossible ways, as if the land itself rejected any claim of ownership. When a federal archivist attempted to restore the damaged records using infrared scanning, an unsettling pattern emerged. Beneath the erased ink, faint outlines of repeating surnames appeared again and again, looping back through generations. The same 6 family names recurred for over a century, intertwined until it became impossible to tell where one line ended and another began. Even more disturbing were the notations in the margins, symbols instead of signatures, resembling crosses intersected with circles and spirals. Some of the markings were fresh, too fresh for ink, supposedly laid down decades earlier. A journalist covering the case tried to publish a story exposing the omissions, but before the article could run, his editor received a cease and desist order citing breach of federal confidentiality. When the journalist returned to his notes, he found entire folders missing from his office. Only a single photograph remained, paper-clipped to his door, a black and white image of a group of people standing in front of the same church Grace had entered. Their faces were blurred beyond recognition, but every single one of them shared the same expression, the same uncanny stillness. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written a date, August 14, 1951, and a message in faded ink that sent a chill down his spine: "You cannot record what was never meant to be counted." Months after the failed investigation into the missing records, a woman named Martha Klein surfaced in a neighboring town with something she claimed would prove the Hollow Clan was real. She was in her late 70s, frail but sharp-eyed, and had spent her youth working as a midwife in the backwoods communities of the Appalachian valleys. In her possession was an old leather-bound journal wrapped in cloth and bound with twine so brittle it crumbled at her touch. The pages were yellowed, water-stained, and smelled of smoke, but the handwriting inside was remarkably clear. Each entry chronicled a birth, a death, or both, spanning nearly 50 years. The mother's name and the father's name were almost always identical. Some entries had only one name at all, followed by a note that read "Pure Blood Maintained." Martha's hands trembled as she explained she had helped deliver many of those children herself, and that most of them were not like other babies. She described their eyes as clouded and their limbs oddly proportioned, their cries more like soft hums than wails. Some didn't live more than a few hours. Others grew strong but silent, their speech never coming, their faces unsettlingly blank. One particular entry in the journal stood out: a birth recorded on a stormy night in 1963. The child had been born with a birthmark shaped like a spiral over its chest, a mark that, according to Martha, appeared again and again in later generations. In the margin beside that entry, written in a different hand, were the words, "The mark returns every third blood." That phrase haunted her for decades, she said, because she began noticing the same spiral carved into trees near the old settlement, etched into fences, even stitched into blankets she was asked to bring to the newborns. When she asked the mothers about it, they would only shake their heads and remember. The deeper one read into her journal, the more grotesque the picture became. It wasn't just a record of births, it was a ritual log. Each generation was catalogued not by year or family branch, but by how close the blood ran. At the end of the book, on the final page, was a note written in what appeared to be dried blood, stating, "When the blood runs too thin, the valley will call it home again." When Martha handed the journal over to local authorities, it vanished from the evidence room within 48 hours. The police labeled it misfiled. Martha insisted it had been taken, and when she died a few weeks later, her house mysterious circumstances. In the ashes, only a single page of the journal was found intact, the one describing the child born with the spiral mark. Years after Martha's death, an investigative reporter named Daniel Royce tracked down the last living person said to have direct contact with the Hollow Clan, a woman known only as Miss Ada. She lived in a nursing home at the edge of Fayette County, her name absent from any public registry, her room paid for in cash by someone who had stopped visiting long ago. Daniel found her seated by the window, her eyes pale and glassy but sharp with recognition when he mentioned the word hollow. At first, she refused to speak, shaking her head violently, whispering that they still hear through the trees. But after hours of gentle coaxing, she began to tell him her story, her voice brittle and uneven, as if every word came from somewhere she had tried for years to bury. She said she had been a schoolteacher sent to the region in the late 1950s, part of a rural education initiative. The map she'd been given showed a cluster of homes in a hollow that no longer appeared on any state documentation. When she arrived, the children met her at the tree line, silent, staring with that same fixed expression Grace Holloway had described decades later. They didn't speak English, or perhaps they didn't speak at all. Their faces bore the same unnerving resemblance, their features repeating from one child to the next like echoes of the same person. The adults were polite but watchful, their speech thick with strange, old dialects. At night, She would hear distant singing from the valley, low, rhythmic chants carried through the fog, the same tune every evening. Ada said that one night, one of the older children came to her cabin, terrified, clutching a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside was a small wooden carving, smooth from age, shaped like a spiral enclosed within a circle. The child begged her to leave before the choosing began. She didn't understand then what it meant, but she took the carving and fled the next morning. From the ridge above the valley, she looked back only once and saw smoke rising not from chimneys, but from pyres. That was the last she ever saw of them. She showed Daniel the carving before she died 3 days later. It was the same spiral symbol found in the photograph first appeared at an estate auction in Charleston, tucked inside a box of old wartime memorabilia. It was small, no larger than a postcard, printed in the deep sepia tones common to the 1930s. The auctioneer dismissed it as a family funeral portrait, but a historian named Dr. Leonard Pierce bought the lot for a few dollars, drawn to the eerie symmetry of the faces captured in the image. When he examined it under proper lighting later that night, he realized it was unlike any photograph he had ever seen. The group stood in front of a weathered church with no visible sign or cross, its doors open to darkness. The people, men, women, and children, were arranged in rows, each with the same vacant expression and the same unnaturally similar features. Their eyes, though small in the grainy photo, seemed to look directly at the viewer with quiet accusation. On the back of the photo, someone had written a date, March 3, 1934, and a single word beneath it, cleansing. Dr. Pierce, unsettled by the phrasing, decided to trace its origin. The photograph's paper type matched those used by a now-defunct studio in Boone County, though there were no official records of such a session. When he reached out to the local archives, he was told that dozens of family records from that region had been sealed under state confidentiality orders. The archivist, uneasy even mentioning the topic, admitted off the record that the image matched descriptions of a long-rumored funeral held for a family that wasn't supposed to exist. According to scattered accounts, it was not a burial but a ceremony meant to mark the end of impurity, a phrase repeated in old local legends tied to the Hollow settlement. Under magnification, Dr. Pierce noticed something chilling. Though the figures appeared human, their shadows didn't fall naturally. Several cast no shadow at all, despite standing under visible sunlight. The children in the front row each clutched small objects that looked like wooden carvings shaped into spirals. When the photo was digitally enhanced, faint etchings became visible on the church's doorframe, the same looping symbol found in Grace Holloway's and Martha Klein's accounts. He contacted a local paper hoping to publish his findings, but before the article could go to print, the photograph vanished from his office. A week later, a package with no return address arrived at his home. Inside was a single envelope containing a copy of the same photograph, but now every face had been blacked out with thick ink. The only thing left visible was the church behind them and the same handwritten word beneath the date, etched more deeply than before, as though someone had rewritten it by hand, cleansing. The discovery of the letters began when a researcher named Olivia Hartwell obtained access to a private archive belonging to a defunct church network that once served the Appalachian region. The documents had been sealed since the 1940s, labeled under genealogical correspondence, and were coated with the yellow dust of decades. Inside the battered wooden box were bundles of envelopes tied with black ribbon, the handwriting so uniform it looked like the work of a single person imitating many. The letters dated back to the late 1800s, and each one carried the same crest, a spiral enclosed in a circle, pressed deep into the wax seals. They were addressed between various members of what was referred to as the family, but what struck Olivia most was how the tone of the writing shifted from affectionate to fanatical as the decades progressed. The earliest letters spoke of isolation and pride, of maintaining our own kind against the intrusion of outsiders. They described marriages as bindings of the sacred thread and children as the fruit of unbroken roots. As time passed, the language grew darker, steeped in obsession. Later correspondences referenced the cleansing of blood and the vow of the covenant, suggesting not just tradition but doctrine. One chilling line repeated across multiple letters read, "To dilute is to decay, and to decay is to invite the world." It was clear these were not ordinary family communications, they were pledges, instructions, and warnings written across generations. In one letter dated 1910, a patriarch named Elias Hollow wrote to another elder, declaring, "The valley must never be breached again. We keep what was given to us, and we give only to our own." The next page bore a crude family chart, lines twisting back on themselves, marriages looping between cousins until the family tree resembled a knot rather than a lineage. Olivia realized the Hollow clan's isolation was not accidental, it was engineered. The letters implied that outsiders who discovered them were not merely turned away but returned to the soil, a phrase repeated often enough to lose its metaphorical innocence. One envelope stood apart from the rest, its seal broken long ago. Inside was a single, unsigned message written in a shaking hand: "They no longer remember why we began. They speak the words but not the meaning. The pact rots, and the blood grows thin." It ended with a symbol drawn hastily across the page, a spiral splitting apart into two uneven halves. When Olivia attempted to catalogue the letters for digital preservation, she discovered several pages missing from her scanned files. Someone had logged into the system and deleted them remotely, leaving behind only a single note in the metadata: "The blood keeps its own secrets." The investigation into the Hollow clan took a darker turn when a young journalist named Marcus Lang decided to document the valley for a national exposé. Armed with a camera, notebooks, and a fierce determination, he set out to retrace the footsteps of those who had disappeared before him. He was aware of the warnings, the missing census records, the vanished researchers, the rumors of the hidden settlement, but he believed that evidence would protect him. Marcus reached the outskirts of the valley on a mist-choked morning, the air cold and damp, and the forest around him strangely still. Every step along the winding path seemed to echo too loudly, as though the trees themselves were listening. By midday, Marcus found the remnants of the settlement. Cabins leaned crookedly, their windows dark and empty, and the overgrown trail led him to the half-collapsed church described in previous accounts. As he explored, he set up cameras to document everything, convinced that visual proof would be the key to convincing authorities. Inside the church, he discovered stacks of decayed photo roots gnarled like the fingers of something clawing its way up from the soil, and the creek that ran through the valley sank. Air smelled of rot and iron, and Marcus felt a growing sense of unease, a creeping awareness that if you hear her calling, do not answer, and for God's sake, do not say her name 3 times. Something unsettling. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and the figures captured on tape appeared to shift between frames, never in the same positions twice. One clip showed the image of a child staring directly into the lens, its eyes reflecting the lantern light unnaturally, and in the next frame, it had vanished entirely. Marcus wrote in his notebook that he felt the valley itself was alive, watching, calculating his every move. By the 3rd day, his sense of safety had vanished completely. While investigating a hidden trail near the creek, he noticed faint footprints that were too small to be his own and too large for any normal child. At night, he heard whispers from the forest, soft chanting that carried in the wind. He returned to his tent, only to find his equipment tampered with, the SD cards missing, notebooks open and smeared with dirt, and his camera lens scratched across its surface. He tried to leave the valley the next morning, but the path he had followed vanished behind him. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the trail. Weeks later, Marcus's footage surfaced under mysterious circumstances. It was incomplete, the edges of the tape scorched, frames missing or obscured, and the final moments revealed nothing but darkness punctuated by fleeting glimpses of pale, identical faces. A single handwritten note accompanied the tape, written on torn church paper: "You should not have looked. We see everything, even what you think is hidden." After that, Marcus Lang was never seen again, and the valley returned to its unnatural silence, waiting for the next outsider who dared to trespass. Decades passed after Marcus Lang's disappearance, and the Hollow clan seemed to vanish from public attention, their valley once again swallowed by fog and forest. But the silence was not the end of their story. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, descendants began appearing in nearby towns. They arrived quietly, blending in with ordinary life, taking on jobs, enrolling in schools, and shopping at local markets. At first, they appeared unremarkable, their movements cautious, their behavior unassuming. But subtle details betrayed them. Their eyes, pale and unusually wide, reflected an almost mechanical awareness, a silent vigilance that made even long-time residents uneasy. Their faces bore the same angular symmetry, the same faint spirals of expression noted in old photographs and journals, and when they spoke, their words often repeated odd turns of phrase that echoed conversations from long ago. Local historians and amateur genealogists noticed patterns in birth records and social networks that seemed to defy explanation. The same surnames, long thought extinct in the area, began to reappear in ways that could not be accounted for by ordinary genealogy. Children were born with the same marks described in Martha Klein's journal, spirals etched faintly into skin or hair, and old photographs of family gatherings showed pairs of cousins with faces so alike that they appeared cloned. Yet, outwardly, these individuals were careful, practicing the secrecy taught across generations. They avoided inquiries, left no digital footprint, and kept the history of their valley buried deep within themselves. An unsettling event occurred when a teacher in a local high school noticed several students consistently avoiding one another while wearing identical handmade jewelry, tiny spirals carved from wood. When asked about it, the students offered a uniform explanation: "It's a promise." The teacher reported the incident, only to have it dismissed as children playing a secret game. But those familiar with the old hollow records recognized it as a ritualistic gesture, a silent pledge to maintain the bloodline's secrecy and cohesion. Occasionally, one of the descendants would vanish for days or weeks, returning without explanation, carrying subtle but noticeable changes in demeanor, as if something had been observed or passed along during their absence. Communities whisper of families moving in and out, leaving behind homes meticulously cleaned, gardens planted with unfamiliar patterns, and, in some cases, objects carved with the ancient spiral motif. The same patterns once confined to a hidden valley now infiltrated towns, a quiet invasion that nobody openly acknowledged but that everyone sensed. Even now, the valley remains, silent and waiting. Its legacy lives on in the people who walk among the general population, their bloodlines interwoven with the modern world, their existence a lingering echo of centuries of secrecy and isolation. The hollow descendants, outwardly ordinary, carry the memory, the ritual, and the pact of a family that refused to vanish entirely, ensuring that the dark legacy of the hidden valley continues, quietly, in plain sight.